Hello, my name is Olivia Mattis, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program on behalf of the Sousa Mendez Foundation. Now, we've just had a few weeks break. I hope that everyone had nice holidays, and now we're launching into the next 10 episodes of our series of uplifting stories of rescue, resistance, and hope. Now, as most of you know, the Sousa Mendes Foundation is a Holocaust remembrance organization. We do honor a hero. His name was Aristides de Sousa Mendes. He saved tens of thousands of people when he was stationed in Bordeaux, France in 1940, right after the fall of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. So he rescued these people and paid a very heavy price. He lost everything, and obviously it's a very heavy story. And most of our programs have to do with remembrance. Today is different because every once in a while one needs to have a celebration, and that's what we have today. We have extraordinary guests today on our panel. So we have the filmmaker Roberta Grossman, whose joyous film you've just seen called Hava Nagila, the movie. And we also presented another film of hers called Blessed is the Match, about the very important and inspiring story of the Jewish hero Hannah Senesh. And in fact, shortly after we presented that program back in January, Mordechai Paldiel from our board of directors petitioned the B'nai B'rith to honor Hannah Senesh as a Jewish rescuer because they have this official program. And as a result of of our program and Mordechai's petition, and of course Roberta's film, now Hannah Senesh has been officially honored by the B'nai B'rith as a Jewish rescuer. So that's very gratifying. So thank you, Roberta, for bringing us this beautiful movie and so many others that maybe we'll show on future programs. Henry Sapoznik is one of the world's experts on the klezmer tradition. And he's here to dispel all kinds of myths that you might have about Hava Nagila and about Jewish music. And what a treat to have him on our program today. And finally, the pianist, Maestro Richard Glazier, is one of the foremost authorities on American popular music, Jewish and other. And this all began when he wrote a fan letter as a child of 12 to Ira Gershwin, the brother of George Gershwin. And as a result of that childhood encounter, he's now one of the foremost performers of Gershwin in the world, of Gershwin and of so many other composers and popular music songwriters. So you're in for a real treat hearing Richard speak and play for you. The other thing I wanted to mention about Richard is that he has some news hot off the press, and that is that he has a program called From Broadway to Hollywood, which has been acquired by Turner Classic Movies and is going to be presented on your local Turner Classic Movie station on Mother's Day, May 9th, sometime that night. So check your listings. It's part of a film festival called the TCM Classic Film Festival. So congratulations, Richard. Now I'd like to turn to our filmmaker, Roberta, and ask you, what did you learn from this film? What surprised you, and what stories might you have to tell that are not in the film?
Sure. Thanks, Olivia. Thanks for the introduction and for having me and making Hava Nagila available to your audience. You mentioned Blessed is the Match. And when I was finishing it, my daughter was 8 years old at the time. And I remember exactly where she was sitting on a stool in the kitchen. And she said, "Mommy, please make a happy movie next time," which I thought was quite wise. And the happy movie was Hava Nagila, the movie. I had been thinking about making a short about Hava Nagila. And then I started talking to the scholars who have delved into the story of Hava Nagila, including James Loeffler, who's a musicologist, Josh Kuhn, who's at USC, a wonderful musicologist. And I realized this was a very rich story, and that through this small window of this one song, that an entire world of Jewish history could be examined in a joyful way. And in terms of what stories aren't included in the film, one of my best, most meaningful Hava stories that's not in the film, I was fundraising for the film, which we always have to do. Our films are made as a nonprofit entity. And there was a fundraiser, and I met a survivor there at a luncheon in New York. And I said, do you have a Hava story for me? And she said, well, I actually do. She was Hungarian, and she had spent the war in various work camps and concentration camps. She somehow, towards the end of the war, was close to Budapest, or in Budapest, in hiding. And when the war ended, the day the war ended, she felt compelled to go to the Doheny synagogue, which was a huge, Jewish synagogue in Budapest. And she just felt compelled to go there. And slowly, she thought that she was the last Jew alive in the world. But slowly, other people started coming to Doheny synagogue. They had the same sensibility that she did. And at one point, there were 20, 25 people there. And they said, well, let's do something to commemorate this moment. And they all decided, let's sing and dance the Hora to Hava Nagila. So I think that expresses a lot about the power of Hava to, express connection and community. So we're lucky to have Henry Sapoznik, who is one of my collaborators on Hava Nagila, the movie. Henry is also a great musicologist. And I reached out to Henry initially to interview him because I was well aware of the fact that not everyone is a big fan of Hava Nagila. And so, I had sort of had Henry pigeonholed as a Hava hater. He hates that I call him a Hava hater. But actually what I found was a whole world of understanding about where Hava sat in the continuum of Jewish music in the United States. And Henry, I was wondering if you could speak about when I first came to you to collaborate, or actually just to interview you, and I went to your camp, Kles camp, to film you, if you could tell me what some of your initial reactions and feelings were about Hava Nagila, and how you tried to educate me about what its role was, for good or bad, or what it represented rather, in Jewish music in the United States, or Yiddish music in the United States.
Well, actually, I think the interesting thing is to look at what the Jewish music world in New York was at the time that Hava came into being. And it was really kind of interesting because of, as your film so eloquently points out, it's a fascinating trajectory from Sadagul to Jerusalem to, so Hava had a bumpy entry into the professional New York Jewish music world, because at the time that it emerged, it came in kind of through a side door. It wasn't like a lot of Jewish music at that time, which was, the Yiddish theater was in full flower, Yiddish radio, Yiddish films. It was a golden age of massive outpouring of creativity from the top down. And Hava came in not as a part of a musical movement, but as a political movement. It came in as a organizing tool, much the same way that the dances that were constructed, Dodi Lee and Mayim and harmonica, those did for dance what Hava was doing in terms of Jewish music, and how the body of professional Jewish musicians before World War II, who were really the carriers of a heightened Jewish cultural literacy, were suddenly faced with this tune that it came from a completely unexpected source.
Can you explain, Henry, what you mean by that it didn't come through the Jewish musical tradition, these people who are the carriers of this Eastern European Jewish tradition? It came from another source. And you mentioned that the film started as a nigun in Sadagora, as a Hasidic nigun. People from that Hasidic sect moved to Palestine before it was a state. And their musicologist, Edelson, picked it up. And it was from there turned into a song with words. The nigunim are silent, basically prayers. That melody was turned into a song with words, quickly matched with the hora, and was part of the culture of pre-state Palestine, and I assume was for some time afterwards. So if you can explain that it came in not from the Eastern European tradition, but it came in by way of this rising Zionist consciousness in the United States. So really it was not a Yiddish song, it was a Hebrew song. If you could talk about that a little bit in terms of the culture in the 50s.
Yeah, well, first, I mean, it started, Sadagur is in the center of the Ashkenazic world. So clearly its roots, like a lot of the Chalutz culture, was a borrowed culture from Eastern Europe and then reimagined. And Edelson was an ideologue. I mean, he was a really profound Zionist, and he saw the power of this piece when he matched the words to the melody that he had transcribed in 1915. I think you mentioned that in the film. So it was like a real spear point of the Chalutz movement and its transition into the Jewish world in the United States came through the fervent the Palestinian Zionist movement, the Chalutz movement. This was heard not in concert halls, but in meeting halls where people were dancing and formulating their consciousness about the rise of Zionism. And it became, again, like the other tunes, that it became an organizing tool, simplified, made incredibly accessible. And that's part of the reason. In fact, what I wanted to do was to share a little bit of music. I wanted to play one track to hear the piece which Hava Nagila replaced as the piece which stood in for Jewish music outside of the Jewish community. Hava Nagila has become reimagined so many times as a kind of a representative of Jewish music. But I thought we'd listen to a little bit of a piece that was the standard stand-in, and it was the Hava Nagila of its time. It's called Chosn Kala Mazel Tov. So Matthew, if we could just play a little bit of that. This is Dave Karras. The reason this was such a major hit, came out of a Yiddish show in 1905, is the repetition in the first section. It's da 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 da. It's the same rhythmic figure, and in a way, that's what Hava Nagila is, a really easy entry because of the repetition. What Hussein Kala Mazel Tov does, though, it has this incredible expansion in the other sections. It goes through all the modes. It goes through a lot of things. So for the musicians of that period, this was something to aspire to, because it really brought out issues of rising to the moment with your musicality. And as we hear from Hava Nagila, the reason it became so popular is that it really easy entry, and people could learn it really quickly. And I think that that's one of the power. And again, it was an ideological decision as much as a musical one. And I think that's what your film really brings to the fore, that it fulfills all these different functions depending on. Unfortunately, among the professional musicians in New York, they all kind of felt, oh my God, it's not a tune, it's an idea for a tune. And there was a lot of resistance. Dave Taras, for example, who we just heard, the dean of the great Yiddish instrumentalists of the interwar years, was not a fan. And in a lot of the musicians, I mean, the great Jewish composers wrote for him: Rumshinsky, Olshanetsky, Elstein, and then he gets his tune. Yeah, you know, I mean, he was just like not impressed. But when he was asked to record it on one of his LPs in the 50s, he said he would not do it. But I just spoke the other day to my friend Pete Sokolow, who was Dave's last accompanist in the 70s. And he said, oh no, Dave recorded that. He did it on a Barry Sisters record. And he said, Dave did it he said, I'm only going to do once through and put me as far away from the microphone as you can. And that's such a not a Dave Taras thing. So here we're going to have like 15 seconds of Dave Taras grudgingly pouring fire into Hava Nagila. We get a slight idea. If Dave had only recorded it, given it the full 3 minutes, he would have been on fire. So this is him taking an 8-measure break in the Barry Sisters mixed English and English version.
Stands everybody
And that's the end of his break.
So Henry, when I hear that, the Barry Sisters and that break, I'm transported to a suburban synagogue, and they're huge, you know, party rooms. What are those called? Whatever, they're meeting rooms, they're party rooms, and people, like in the film, people begrudgingly getting up from their rubber chicken to dance the hora. And it became Hava became, you know, if it were a bar mitzvah or a wedding, if you didn't have Hava, you didn't have it was like you didn't have the ceremony. And I'm wondering what that represents. I mean, until the present day, I mean, you might have a wedding or a bar mitzvah, and the only Jewish thing in the party is some truncated version of Hava. Wondering if you comment on that move to the suburbs and what that meant musically and what that meant to musicians, and Hava's place in that.
I mean, by the 60s, things had changed dramatically, because of course, after the war, the decline of literacy in the Yiddish world, the disappearance of Yiddish in the face of Hebrew, a lot of social changes meant people like Dave Taras, as great as they were still in the service industry, and ultimately had to play what people wanted. They could only be a window to the community just so much. They had to be a mirror for the community much more if they expected to continue to work. So by the 60s, the older stuff, as the dances and the rituals fell away, the older stuff disappeared, and this more than made up for it, because it was ubiquitous. Everyone had heard, as the film points out, it was everywhere, and I think that was a very ennobling and uplifting thing, because it puts people in contact with each other who ordinarily may not have, a cultural link to each other. But Hava was a goodwill ambassador out of the Jewish community.
Right. So Hava embodies both the loss of this rich tradition and is the embodiment of it. I always saw Hava sort of as a little acorn that all within it is the blueprint for, the magnificent oak tree. But that's not how our friend Bob Dylan saw Hava Nagila, and I think he probably heard it in a suburban hall.
He had a Jewish upbringing. I mean, he probably heard it at his bar mitzvah. What's really cool about this piece is it's Bob Dylan yet again making up this creation myth for himself. The name Bob Dylan is part of the creation myth. And here he says, oh, here's this foreign song I learned in Utah. It's like Dylan telling Sing Out magazine, oh, I ran away and joined the circus. He was constantly in a sense of reinventing himself. So yeah, this is a real send up.
So what we're talking about is that there's a very brief, I think it's 50-second version of Bob Dylan doing Hava Nagila, and you'll hear that he starts it the way that Henry said, this is a foreign song I learned in Utah. And by foreign song, I think he means, not Jewish. Utah seems to him probably to be the least Jewish place he can think of in the moment. And then he just really skewers Hava. And I guess he's probably skewering the Jewish culture or lack therein that he grew up in. So Matthew, do you want to play that?
Here's a foreign song I learned in Utah. Ha, va, hava, na, Havana, gi, Havana, gi, la, Havana, gi, la, orla,
I just want to say one thing about Hava Nagila. If those who are interested, if you Google Josh Kuhn, K-U-N, Bob Dylan, Hava Nagila, Josh Kuhn has a brilliant rant, essentially, a lecture, very brief lecture, a rant about Bob Dylan's Hava Nagila and what it means. And really, if you are interested in this strange cultural artifact, I urge you to look at Josh Kuhn, Hava Nagila, Bob Dylan. Okay, that's it for us. Richard.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to watch that Bob Dylan clip, which I was not familiar with until we just saw just a minute ago. And what struck me in seeing Dylan do that is really the tapestry of what American music was all about. And at the turn of the century, Jewish music and black music and Western civilization, classical music, if you will, all kind of melded together, the Yiddish theater on the Lower East Side of New York, to create a unique American voice, whether it was a Hebrew melody or a Yiddish melody. And when we listen to Mr. Zimmerman do that 50-second clip just now, what's very interesting is, okay, so he starts singing that opening that Henry talked about, that's so clear, it's so obvious, that opening of Hava Nagila. But then, as we say in Mitten Drinnen, in the middle of everything, what does he do? He starts yodeling, for goodness sake. And then, after he yodels, he starts playing the harmonica. So it's this complete tapestry of different cultures coming together in that actually brilliant 50 seconds of Hava Nagila. It represents, again, another aspect of that tune and fitting its way into American, not just American Jewish culture, but just American culture, really in the best sense of the word. that America represents that tapestry of all the many cultures that came here to make a better life for themselves. And of course, the Jews came and settled on the Lower East Side of New York, and it went on from there. What's interesting also is that it was talked about earlier by Henry and Roberta, is that, and in the wonderful film, and it's such a terrific movie, so educational and entertaining at the same time. Who could ask for anything more, as George and Ira Gershwin said. What's so interesting is that we talked about that Hava Nagila originally came from a nigun, which is a wordless Hebrew melody. And it has its roots in the Hebraic tradition, not in the Yiddish tradition. And of course, we all, as Jews, Orthodox Jews, felt, and even today, that you get closer to God through music and not words. And that was kind of like the motivation of the nigun. And in 1925, Ernst Bloch, the Swiss composer, was the president of the Cleveland Institute of Music. He had come to America. And he wrote a piece, a violin orchestra piece, for a faculty member at the Cleveland Institute of Music called the Baal Shem Suite, which of course was named after the Baal Shem Tov, who of course was the founder of the Hasidic movement. Many people say he lived from, I believe, 1698 to 1760, right around the time of Bach. And so in this Baal Shem Suite that's created for violin and orchestra, Bloch gives us the first one, which is Vidui. Then he gives us Nigun, which fits right into what Hava Nagila stemmed from, where Edelson got the motivation to create that melody and take off from it. And then, of course, the third movement is Simchas Torah. So I thought it'd be very nice to hear the wonderful Israeli violinist Shlomo Mintz play Nigun by Ernst Bloch, which, of course, the nigun, as I say, was motivated stems from, or Hava Nagila stems from the nigun, this wordless melody. Of course, it was eventually set, words were set to, as Henry explained to us a little bit earlier. So why don't we hear this clip of Ernst Bloch's nigun from the Baal Shem Suite. You get the idea of this holy kind of thing, getting closer to God through music and not words. And what's also interesting, I think, in the Yiddish tradition of music, in the Yiddish theater, and also in the Hebraic tradition, as was delineated with Henry also, there's something that shares in common, and that is the interval of the minor third and the harmonic minor scale, which gives us, as Jews, we all like to suffer, right? And the minor third interval gives us that touch of melancholy, that touch of sadness, even infused in something like Hava Nagila. And we'll talk about this later, but even the cantor that speaks in Roberta's glorious documentary talks about this sense of when you slow down Hava Nagila, you get that sense of melancholy, of sadness with that minor third. So what's very interesting is, of course, we have the rise of the Yiddish theater at in the teens and the 20s in New York City. And there were several composers who wrote specifically for the Yiddish theater. And one of the great songs of that time was called Eufen Perpetchek. Of course, many of you might know that, about the rabbi that sits around the Feirle teaching the Aleph Beis, the alphabet, to the students. And it's become kind of like a, if you will, a trademark of the Yiddish theater. Everybody kind of knows this song, like everybody kind of knows Hava Nagila. Well, what's very interesting, and in my research and in my dedication to the American popular song and the Jewish culture and Hollywood films, of course, we all know that the Hollywood moguls were mostly all Jewish. You know, Jack Warner, Louis B. Mayer, Samuel Goldwyn, Harry Cohn, so many of them. But they didn't like to talk about it. The Jewishness was not really discussed in the industry at that time, in the 40s, 30s and 40s. Although the very first talking motion picture was The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson that had a Jewish story. So go figure. I mean, life is full of these contradictions. So in 1945, there was a film made by Warner Brothers called Rhapsody in Blue. It starred Robert Alda, the father of Alan Alda, playing George Gershwin. And the film is a highly fictitious account of the lives of George and Ira Gershwin, who of course lived the American dream, were first generation Americans. Their parents had come from Russia to come to the better life and came over in steerage. And George heard the many voices of Jewish culture, Yiddish culture, Hebrew culture, black culture, again, as I was saying early, to fuse this unique American tapestry. So in this film of 1945, you see George and Ira in the film, and they talk about the Lower East Side, and we see the Lower East Side and all this kind of thing. But there is not one mention of Judaism. There is not one mention of religion. Nothing. It's completely left out of the story of Rhapsody in Blue. But right in the middle of the movie, in the underscoring of the film, which with no mention of any Judaism, no nothing, in the middle of the underscoring of this 1945 film, this is what we hear in Rhapsody in Blue, the biography of George and Ira Gershwin. Let's get that. So imagine, in the middle of this film where Judaism is not addressed at all, you have these dramatic scenes going on, and this is what you hear underneath the movie. So they're kind of subconsciously bringing Judaism into Hollywood during that movie, which I found extremely interesting. And of course, the Yiddish theater is at its height, and whether it's Hebrew music, whether it's Hava Nagila, whether it's Eufen Perpetchek or the next song that we're going to talk about, we come back to a common theme. And do you agree with me, Henry, about this minor third interval being so important? Do you agree with what I'm saying there?
Yeah, but the thing to keep in mind is that is the great thing, and I want to take away from what you're talking about, but that minor second, what's called a phragish in the tradition, comes from cantorial singing.
Chant.
That's the
Yes.
center of the concentric circle. You have to keep in mind that we can't ascribe sadness or happiness because, for example, a lot of dance music makes use of that, and it's called freilachs.
Freilachs, yeah.
Means happy. So,
Right.
so ascribing sadness is out of.
But there's always a
context.
tinge, but maybe a tinge of melancholy somewhere. Maybe I'm being overly romantic here, Henry. I don't know.
Well, and anyway, the point is, it is a critical thing because that interval links East and West. That
Exactly.
interval puts the Jewish world at the crossroads of both universes of where they came from and where they went. So it's a critical element of identity. So
Now,
anyway, just to
That's
understand
very.
what
Thank
you're
you for
saying.
that. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that for sure. There was a very famous cantor in the 20s and 30s. His name was Yessel Rosenblatt. He was from the Ukraine, which of course played a part in Hava Nagila film as well, when Roberta went to the Ukraine and had that incredible meeting with that rabbi who was related to one of the Hava Nagila. What was his name, Roberta? I'm
Rabbi
putting her on the spot. Yeah.
Rabbi Friedman, and his great grandfather was the Rebbe of that Sadagora.
He's the Sadagoro Rebbe. Yeah, he was
The Sadagora Rebbe
right.
from which the Nigun came. Yeah.
It was just Beshert that she ran in Ukraine of all things. It wasn't like going to New York City or Los Angeles. She was in the Ukraine and found this guy as she had her film crew. You talk about Beshert, my goodness. Well, cantor Yessel Rosenblatt also came from the Ukraine, and he immigrated to America during that mass wave of immigration. And Rosenblatt, he was an Orthodox Jew. He was a superstar. This guy could improvise like nobody's business. His beautiful tenor voice. He was called the Jewish Caruso, and he sold thousands of records on the '78 Columbia label. And he also made an appearance in the 1927 film The Jazz Singer. And they brought him to Hollywood, and they paid him a fortune to sing in The Jazz Singer. But he would not sing liturgical music, only secular music. He refused to sing liturgical, but he was this incredible voice. And we're going to see a clip of Yessel Rosenblatt singing, again, one of the great Yiddish songs from the Yiddish theater, My Yiddish Mama. And of course, My Yiddish Mama was made famous by Sophie Abruzza, Sophie Tucker, of course, from Hartford, Connecticut. And in My Yiddish Mama, of course, they're talking about, the son is talking about the sacrifices that his mother had made to come to this new country to make a better life. And there's this element of Jewish guilt built into it. And of course, we have that minor mode again. And Tom Jones recorded it, of all things. Connie Francis recorded it very much, again, like in Roberta's documentary. She interviews Connie Francis about singing Hava Nagila. So it's crossed over. I mean, if Tom Jones is singing My Yiddish Mama, Andy Williams is singing My Yiddish Mama, it doesn't get more not Jewish than those guys. It's just amazing how it crosses over. But that's the beauty of this. This is the beauty of music. This is the beauty of the cultures kind of melding together. This is America. This is what America is supposed to be. So anyway, let's hear Rosenblatt sing My Yiddish Mama. Now imagine that's the man that was brought to Hollywood in 1927 to co-star with Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer, of course, about a cantor's son who wants to go into popular music and not become the Orthodox cantor like his father in that tradition. And Rosenblatt, I say, was a superstar. People loved his music, Jewish and non-Jewish. Which brings me to the next section, next final clip that I'm going to show and play. So Al Jolson, of course, might as well, his life, Asa Jolson, it's like the story of the jazz singer. It's the same. His father was a cantor. Jolson grew up in the cantorial tradition, singing all that liturgy. He knew the Yiddish theater backwards and forwards. And in 1948, 2 years before his death, Larry Parks stars in the Jolson story where he portrays Al Jolson. But Jolie sings all of his own. He dubs Larry Parks' voice. And this is very interesting because here, what we're going to hear is something that comes from Romania. It was a song that was composed in the 1880s. And it had that minor third. It had a lot of characteristics of the Jewish music. Again, kind of a crossover, although it was called on the waves of the Danube. And so what Jolson did with the associate producer of that movie, Saul Chaplin, who was a first-generation Jew from the Lower East Side of New York. And Saul Chaplin was the other person. You take By Bir Bist Du Shane, the Yiddish folk song. It became a huge hit by the Andrews Sisters, for goodness sakes. It doesn't get any waspier than that. These girls from Minnesota singing By Bir Bist Du Shane. Also, they sang And the Angels Sing by Ziggy Elman, the trumpeter from the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. That's based on a Yiddish folk song, And the Angels Sing. So what Saul Chaplin did, and Al Jolson, is they took this Romanian tune, they adapted it, made it a little bit Jewish, a lot Jewish, and we're going to hear Jolson sing it, and here we hear this fusion of Eastern European music and Jewish music, as Henry was talking about a little bit earlier, that difference and how it came together. So let's listen. Well, actually, before we listen to it, here, I'm going to play it for you. So let's hear Jolie sing it now.
Da 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 da
Remember that, Asa? Heard you sing it 1,000 times, Papa. That was the waltz at our wedding. Come on, Asa, come on, sing with me. No, you go ahead, Papa. Oh, listen to this. There's a little boy who used to sing with me at the synagogue. Well, what's the matter? Too big a man now, huh? Mama, tell me the truth. Who was always a better singer, me or Asa?
You, of course, Papa.
Ah, you hear that? Hey, come on. Please.
How we danced on the night we were wed. We vowed our true love, though a word wasn't said. The world was in bloom. There were stars in the skies, except for the few that were there in your eyes. Dear, as I held you close in my arms, angels were singing a hymn to your charms. Two hearts gently beating, murmuring low, darling, I love you so. The night seemed to fade into blossoming dawn. The sun shone anew, but the dance lingered on. Could we but recall that sweet moment sublime, we'd find that our love is unaltered by time.
Before close up my section to wrap it up, Henry, I don't mean to drag you into this. We didn't rehearse this or talk about this, but could you maybe put a little knot on what I've talked about and Hava Nagila? Or is that asking too much off the top? Find some, just kind of, since you're the scholar of klezmer and could you kind of put a little knot, a conclusion on what we just heard and relate it to Hava Nagila to a sense?
What we just heard?
Well, just overall the different musics that I just played, from the Nagoon to the, I mean, is it apples and oranges, or is there a commonality here?
Well, I mean, we're really talking about a lot of different delivery platforms, everything from Western art music to mass popular culture to film. Each of those has their own standard of how they mediate this stuff. So yeah, I mean, everything is, and this is what Idelson did. Idelson was also, everything was sort of reinterpreted for its new intended audience. And I think each of these things really show how, people really saw this music as malleable and endlessly reinventing it for like all of these. None of these audiences were intended by the original creators of these pieces. It's kind of yeah. So it's a big overview of how Jewish music is sort of like distributed. Yeah, it's a lot of territory.
and a lot of territory, but all fitting into the tapestry of America at the turn of the century in a good way, in my opinion.
So I'm going to take the floor back right now, briefly, just to talk about.
Do you have to? Do you have to, Olivia?
Just to talk a little bit about upcoming programs. Then we're going to go to the audience questions. There are a lot of questions in the chat box. I don't know how many we'll have time for. And then we have a very special treat waiting for you at the end of the program, so please don't go anywhere. So right now, let me tell you about a few of the upcoming programs. So next week, we are moving to the 1970s and talking about a famous rescue mission, which was the rescue at Entebbe. And that is a free program. We have one of the heroes of the Entebbe rescue, Rami Sherman, who will be with us live from Israel to talk about what it was like that day. And so that will be very thrilling and you won't want to miss it. The week after that, we have, I think, a very important conversation. We have an author named Irshad Manji, who is one of the people in the Muslim world who has worked the hardest to try to eradicate anti-Semitism, among other biases against women and LGBT people, but particularly against Jews in the Muslim world. This has been a particular work of hers. She wrote a very important book called The Trouble with Islam Today. She will be in conversation with Abraham H. Foxman of the Anti-Defamation League. So that is a conversation you absolutely won't want to miss. They are also both offering signed and inscribed copies of books in conjunction with that program for April 25th. That's the date of that program. You'll have information about all of that in the email you receive later today after the program. So right now, let's listen to a little clip of Irshad Manji talking about a turning point in her own life.
There's no doubt that I've made many cowardly decisions in my life. I've self-censored on any number of occasions, but I think the one that stands out for me was when I was in the 9th grade, and I had a Jewish teacher who was subjected to a great deal of anti-Semitism from fellow classmates. And I remember walking into the classroom. He was my English teacher, Mr. Goldman. And I remember walking into the classroom one afternoon and seeing swastikas in chalk on all of the blackboards. And I looked at my fellow classmates who were giggling, and I looked at the swastikas and I looked back at my fellow classmates, and Mr. Goldman had not yet entered the room. And I just took my seat and I said nothing. And he walked into the room and his eyes welled up with tears, as I feel like mine are doing right now. And he took the brush and cleaned off the blackboards, didn't say a word, and went on with the English lesson. What I can't tell you I did to begin to redeem myself is I came up to him after the class was over and told him how profoundly sorry I was that I didn't say anything to the class. And he said, well, why should you? You weren't the one who put those swastikas on the blackboard, were you? I said, no, I wasn't, sir. And he said, then it's not your responsibility. And I said, in fact, it is my responsibility. You know why? Because I knew that that was wrong. If I didn't know it was wrong, maybe I could let myself off the hook, because then there would be nothing to struggle with. But I knew that was wrong. And I said nothing. And I think that moment, needless to say, has stayed with me for my entire life. And though I don't know it, most of the time when I speak up, it is with the spirit of that moment in my conscience.
So I do hope you sign up for that program and our other programs to come. Now let's get to your questions. So for Roberta, here is a question. Besides heeding your daughter's plea that you produce a film with a happy theme, what inspired you to choose Hava Nagila as your theme?
Well, I really love Jewish history, and I read an article by James Loeffler, who I mentioned before, called The long, strange journey of Hava Nagila, and it traces Hava Nagila through from Ukraine to Israel to the United States, basically following the story of the Jewish people in the 20th century. And I thought that it was a remarkable way to tell the story of Jewish history through popular culture, and that was very compelling to me.
Now, what's the answer to the question? Who wrote the song, Edelson or his student?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. It's caused a lot of pain, actually, that question, to both families. I interviewed both families while making the film, and this conflict has really caused them both a great deal of pain. And I meant to leave the question unanswered in the film, but I think that because I let Loeffler speak last and he kind of comes down on the side of it could be, but I don't think so. It gave the impression that that was my opinion, because of course I was editing the film. And if I could do it over again, I would put that earlier and then let more doubt and controversy go back and forth. I really don't know. I mean, I don't think that the student had any reason to lie. And ultimately, if I remember my history right, at some point in the 70s, 60s or 70s or 80s, it was actually a court case. And unfortunately for both families, both lost out because it was determined that the song was in the public domain because it was a folk song.
Right.
So, right, Henry? Is that?
Well, it was always in the public domain. That's the odd thing, is that this thing had gone through dozens of permutations before Edelson, wrote it down for the celebration in Jerusalem. So it's a hard thing to nail down. It's not like you could say, "Oh, this guy wrote it."
But can't you copyright or the words and the music joined together and the arrangement, or can you not? If the source music,
you can copyright an arrangement, and if the words are original, but the melody, I mean, it's in public domain. It's hard to create. I mean, there's the thing, the Sadagur Hasidim who made Aliyah to Jerusalem before World War I, who were supposedly the carriers of the tune, which is where Edelson first heard it. So he wasn't making a claim that he wrote it. No one is making a claim that they wrote the melody. They're just, and it's a pretty typical Jewish thing. We inherit stuff and we make it our own.
So before we get to our little surprise at the end of the program, I just want to take this opportunity not only to thank our fantastic panel of speakers and our loyal audience that comes week after week, but also this week we have a fabulous, gift, which is that we have a sponsor who very kindly underwrote and sponsored the tickets for anyone who requested one, for whom that was an issue. And that was just a very generous and very touching thing for this anonymous donor to do. And I just wanted to express my thanks here. So Henry, why don't you introduce our last segment?
Oh gosh, well, this is, we're gonna go out with some music, which is how much better can that be? Richard, I believe you're going to tickle the ivories. Yes, you are.
Or in my case, the plastics.
Thank you all and see you next week. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.